Program. We begin with the first hopes for dialogue over the war in Ukraine. President Volodymyr Zelensky's office says it will hold negotiations with Russian officials at the border with Belarus. Russia says talks have not yet begun, but the two sides are arriving at the location. In other developments, President Vladimir Putin has put Russia's nuclear forces on alert in an escalation of tensions with the West. The US has accused him of manufacturing threats. Meanwhile, fighting continues on the ground in Ukraine. Russian forces have attacked fuel depots and there are reports of explosions outside the capital, Kiev. The mayor says there are no Russian troops in the city. Battles are still going on around other population centres. Well, for more, let's bring in DW correspondent Nick Connolly, who's in Vinnytsia in western Ukraine. Nick, the Ukrainian side has announced that the negotiations have already begun, but the Russian Foreign Ministry has denied that. Do we know for sure what is happening?
Unfortunately, as always, right over the last few days, we don't have any conclusive information either way. That's been the same way in terms of the actual fighting, where there are barely any journalists on the ground, and obviously during war there's censorship, so no side really giving a full picture. It is important that this is even happening at all, and it's happening without preconditions. That's being seen as a big victory for Ukraine, because the Russians basically were pushing for the Ukrainians to turn up and sign what essentially amounts to a capitulation, basically demilitarizing, allowing Russia a lot more influence over their internal politics, and basically allowing Russia to kind of delegitimize Ukraine's democratically elected government. But as for these talks, I'm not very confident there's actually going to be much to them. We've heard as much from Volodymyr Zelenskyy, who says he's not impressed or particularly convinced, because this could just be a tactic by Russia to win some time. We've seen Russian troops, Russian tanks getting stuck on roads in Ukraine, stuck while invading Ukraine because they basically haven't caught up with their fuel supplies. So this could be just another bit of tacticking from Vladimir Putin. He did the same just before this invasion, where he hinted to Emmanuel Macron of France that he was open to some big summit. There would be meetings between foreign ministers. And then, before those meetings had even happened, he sent his tanks rolling over the border. So not much trust here in Ukraine. The Russians are playing fairly. And I think it's also just important to stop for a minute and just think how crazy the situation is. They're going to be meeting at the border next to the Chernobyl nuclear power station on the border between Ukraine and Belarus. This is like something out of a kind of fantasy novel. Russian troops control the Chernobyl nuclear power station, which is the site of the world's biggest nuclear incident. It's 60 kilometers from Kiev. So if there are any fighting there, huge risks to civilians. And the fact that now these two countries are meeting at a border next to a nuclear disaster zone is just an indication for you of what extraordinary kind of territory we're on right now.
Give us a sense, Nick, of how the people are feeling in Ukraine. Do they have hope for these peace talks, or given the brutality of the last 4 days, are they just focused more on fighting to defend their country at this point?
I think it's definitely more of the latter. I think Ukrainians have been very cheered by seeing how well the Ukrainian army is holding up against the Russian army, especially lots of the Western weapons, the anti-tank missiles that have been brought to Ukraine from the US, from the UK, seem to be pretty effective, and they've definitely slowed down this Russian advance. When you read the Russian military analysts, they seem pretty shocked at how slow this advance is going. They thought they could just have some kind of blitz and get to Kiev within a day or two and send the Ukrainian government into exile, fleeing out of Kiev. That hasn't happened. Lots of Russian troops being taken prisoner, lots of these tanks, images everywhere on social media here of destroyed tanks, and also lots of Ukrainians. I was just in a youth center today where you had dozens of young people, if not hundreds, making camouflage netting, collecting food and equipment for the troops, but also for refugees heading west from Kiev. So if Vladimir Putin was trying to demoralize Ukrainians, it seems like he's achieved just the opposite.
Nick, darkness has fallen again. Nerves are, I guess, a constant for the people. But just quickly, are nights the most nervous times during an invasion?
Definitely, and we've been spending a lot of our time in bomb raid shelters, in this case where we are in just this block's cellar. And just to give you a bit of insight, the reason why I'm sitting here in this living room in front of a bookshelf is because I can't stand outside with light, with a camera light, or even at the window without locals being worried that I'm trying to give some kind of signals that I'm a kind of sleeper agent. And it all sounds like something from a novel, but this is real. These kind of cases have been found. Just today, there have been reports of Russian agents trying to destroy a radar site about 10 kilometers from where I am now. Lots of shooting there. I can't verify that, but it does seem to fit the bigger pattern. So people are very nervous, very distrusting of strangers, but overall not panicking and fairly cheered right now by where this is going, and the ability of the Ukrainian army to actually sit this out and to make Russia think twice about whether this is actually going to work.
Our DW correspondent Nick Connolly in Western Ukraine, thanks so much. Well, Russian forces are meeting stiff resistance as they attempt to push further into Ukraine. The mayor of Kiev says the capital is holding its defensive lines and there are no Russian troops in the city itself. And after reports of heavy fighting in eastern Kharkiv, the regional governor says Ukrainian forces have retaken full control of the city. Russia's latest attacks have targeted civilian infrastructure as well as the military.
Chaos at an oil depot in Valsikiv, just outside of Kiev. Emergency services battled to the early morning after Russian rocket fire destroyed the facility. It's just one of the many targets of Russian fire overnight. That night was hard. What did they do? This is revenge. The people rose to defend their state, and they, the Russian army, showed their real face. This is terror. They're going to bomb our Ukrainian cities even more. They're going to kill our children even more insidiously. This is evil. Russia has confirmed it destroyed what it called 975 military targets in the campaign so far. But many of its rockets have landed in civilian areas, killing and maiming bystanders. Here in Kiev, civilians continue to seek shelter in the city's subway stations. There's little hope, it seems, for a quick end to the fighting.
The European Union is to finance the purchase and delivery of weapons and equipment to Ukraine for the first time. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen says the bloc is also closing its airspace to Russian aircraft and will ban state-owned media. Von der Leyen announced new sanctions targeting the regime of Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko as well for supporting Russia's action. Here's a little of what she had to say.
We will introduce restrictive measures against their most important sectors. This will stop their exports of products from mineral fuels to tobacco, wood and timber, cement, iron and steel. We will also extend to Belarus the export restrictions we introduced on dual-use goods for Russia. This will also avoid any risk of circumvention of our measures against Russia. And in addition, we will sanction those Belarusians helping the Russian war effort.
For more, let's bring in DW correspondent Christine Mundwa in Brussels. Christine, a big day. What stood out for you?
Anthony, for the first time in the European Union's history, the bloc is going to collectively purchase and supply lethal military aid for a third country. In this case, that is Ukraine. We understand that this is to the amount of some 450 million euros. Now, this is under what is called the European Peace Facility. It's a mechanism that was launched last year, and it has rolled out some assistance to the African Union, for example. But this assistance was non-lethal assistance. And now, for the first time, the bulk of the money that has been dedicated to a single country, a third country, Ukraine, is going to be lethal assistance. And that is the first time, again, in the bloc's history. It was also announced that individual member states that have already donated military assistance to the Ukrainian armed forces are going to be compensated. That is, the bloc is going to refund them for that. And we're talking about retrospective compensation going as far back to military aid that was given in January, for example. And they say that the idea here is to encourage individual member states to continue to support the Ukrainian armed forces and also to maybe encourage others to start doing so as well. So a strong show of solidarity in terms of coming together as the bloc in reaching the decision to support the Ukrainian armed forces. Separately to that, in addition to the flight ban of all Russian aircraft on EU airspace, more individuals in Russia, about 20, are going to be further sanctioned, as well as, of course, Belarus to receive further sanctions as well.
Christine Mundwa in Brussels, thanks so much. Well, meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin has put his deterrence forces, including nuclear-armed forces, on high alert. In a video distributed by the Kremlin, Putin said NATO powers have made aggressive statements towards Russia. He also blamed economic sanctions that will cut off Russian banks from international transactions. So he's blaming the West for his decision to put Russia's nuclear forces on alert. Let's have a listen to what Mr. Putin had to say exactly.
Not only are Western countries taking unfriendly economic steps against our country, I mean the illegal sanctions that everyone knows about very well, but the top officials of leading NATO countries are also making aggressive statements about our country. Therefore, I order the Minister of Defense and the Chief of the General Staff to put the deterrent forces of the Russian military to a special mode of combat duty.
DW correspondent Emily Sherwin is here in Berlin from Moscow after Russia withdrew her journalistic accreditation. Good to have you here under any circumstances, Emily. What we've just heard, the words, the move, is this a sign that Putin is rattled?
Well, we don't know. It does seem, judging from what military experts in Russia are saying, that this military operation is taking quite a bit longer than Russia expected. But I think these words from Putin, are a clear sign that he wants the West to keep out. He ordered Russia's deterrence forces to be placed on standby. And he said that that was because NATO leaders were expressing aggression towards Russia. So this is kind of him throwing Russia's weight around, showing that it's an important power on the world stage. And actually, we've heard that nuclear threat, veiled nuclear threat, or not so veiled, before already a few days earlier. He also talked about consequences that you've never faced in your history if you meddle, kind of addressing the West. So I think he's kind of trying to say, Ukraine is our sphere of influence, keep out of this conflict.
For the first time, Russian authorities have admitted that Russian soldiers have indeed been killed in this invasion. What does that tell us?
Well, I think that's quite a change in the narrative, or it could signal a change in the narrative. State TV so far has kind of been talking about, or very much emphasizing the fact that Russian forces were not hitting civilian infrastructure at all. And I heard one show they were talking about scalpel-like accuracy. They're just hitting military infrastructure, no civilians. It's almost the perfect operation. Now we've heard the Ministry of Defense come out and say that there are casualties. They haven't said that the exact numbers of casualties, which I think is interesting, but they did say that they're far lower than on the other side, on the Ukrainian side, so kind of a vague statement. Today was the first time also we heard that they also admitted that one general had been killed, but this could become a real problem, I think, a PR problem with this operation for Russia going forward, because there's quite a bit of opposition against this war anyway. We've seen today, again, anti-war protests. Almost 2,000 people were arrested in various cities across the country. Other people who believe the state TV narrative have believed that this is going to be a short and victorious war. But if the body bags start arriving back in Russia, that could be, a real issue, I think, for the Kremlin.
Leads to a broader question about the information. Russia cracks down hard on media outlets and social media, as you've witnessed yourself. What does the media landscape in Russia look like today?
Well, it's been strange watching the coverage of this, actually, because, for example, today I got a push notification from state media saying in Kharkiv, which we talked about before in the eastern part of Ukraine, Russian forces have entered. That was a critical media outlet. And then the state media outlet that said soldiers have voluntarily laid down their arms in Kharkiv. So you're getting kind of these parallel narratives about this war. And at the same time, within Russia, there's been quite a crackdown on critical media and also on internet freedom, on social media as well. The media last week was told that they're only allowed to use Russian official sources when reporting about this conflict. 10 media outlets received a warning and were told to delete information articles that called this operation a war, an invasion. And today, the General Prosecutor's Office said that anyone who offers financial or other help for foreign government organizations, foreign organizations, could be considered, to be committing treason, which could mean that they face up to 20 years in prison. And there's been a precedent of a journalist, a well-known journalist, being hit with that accusation. So I think that could really affect journalists as well. And meanwhile, Facebook has been slowed down and other social media outlets. So I think we're going to see quite a crackdown on the media sphere, information sphere, the internet and social media in the coming days and weeks.
Great to get your insights and knowledge after 4.5 years in Moscow. Emily Sherwin, good to get a chance to talk.
Thanks.
Well, the European Union is organising a huge logistical operation to deal with the hundreds and thousands of Ukrainians fleeing their homeland. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen says the bloc welcomes them with open arms. Most of the refugees are heading for Poland. Huge queues have formed as people try to leave.
Exhausted, but happy to have made it to Poland. For Natalia Kuksa and her son Ivan, an opportunity to finally rest. Their group left Ukraine with the first alarm and only got here now.
I'm not scared about me and my son, but I'm scared about my husband, my parents.
Natalia tells us her husband had to stay behind. He may have to fight.
And of course, my son very cry when they because they separate, and he wanted to see the husband. Always call him and say, "I wanted to be with you."
A former warehouse now serves as a provisionary shelter, a safe haven for those who don't have anywhere to go. There is no shortage of donations, including food, diapers, and blankets. Most of it is handled by volunteers. People from all over Poland and even abroad are pitching in to help, with rides out of town and even places to sleep. We are very concerned with all what is happening. This is great injustice, and I think everyone should help. Joseph, Eric, and Francis are also in need of help. The Nigerian students barely made it across the border, they tell us. This is not the only report of Africans having been sent to the back of the queue by Ukrainian border guards.
There was a lot of discrimination going on there, where we actually had to beg people to take us into the border so we could find a way to escape. But of course, racism, discrimination, no one listened to us because, of course, skin color and everything.
Back inside, Evgeny Kipichenko is waiting for his wife to reunite with him and his son Ilya.
It was a very hard trip for me.
For his mother, the trip isn't over yet. She is still stuck at the border after a night out in the cold. His mother is also under huge stress, but she is holding up. She is very strong. She is now helping other people with her at the border and trying to calm them down and offering her car so they can keep warm. Together, they plan to carry on to Latvia and then perhaps to England, just far enough away from the war.
Well, DW correspondent Max Zander is standing by at the Polish Ukrainian border. Max, tell us how things are looking where you are.
Right, the situation here at the Polish-Ukrainian border seems somewhat under control for now, but you can really tell, being here on the ground, that the situation is slowly changing and more people are coming. The Polish Prime Minister today said that 200,000 people from Ukraine have made their way to Poland so far. That's roughly 100,000 more than yesterday. So in the beginning of the last couple of days, most people who would arrive here would be people who have some sort of connections to Poland, who would have family members or relatives or friends living here and would have a place to turn to. Now, the people we've talked to throughout the course of the day here who are arriving now appear to be people who are going to Poland as the closest safe space, so to say, with no real place to turn to or no real plan. But there is a lot of help here. As you can see, we're at a parking lot close to the Polish border where volunteers are handing out donations here behind me, where they can get a hot meal, where there's some medical attention attention. The Polish authorities have made sure to prepare for this situation, and we'll have to wait and see. Time will tell if the coordination is going to be good enough once the numbers really pick up what people here on the ground are expecting.
Max, the sheer volume of people is clearly an issue, but can you expand on reports of problems on the Ukrainian side for people trying to leave the country?
Right, so the situation on the other side of the border seems to be very dire for the people who are stuck there. We're talking of long lines of cars, naturally, because everybody is trying to leave Ukraine at once. In addition to that, people are stuck there. Traffic is moving very slowly, and that is also because Ukrainian border forces authorities are conducting intense checks on the people leaving. That has to do with them not wanting males in the fighting age between 18 and 60 to leave the country, because there is conscription and they're expected to support the military service. But in addition to that, we've also heard some reports. We've talked to some people here who arrived here today, and there are some reports of foreigners being discriminated against, in particular African students. There have been multiple reports of them being taken off the train to make place for Ukrainian nationals, of them being sent back to the end of the line to let Ukrainian nationals at first. So there seems to be also some sort of discrimination in that sense that's happening at the border while people are trying to flee.
DW correspondent Max Zander at the Polish-Ukrainian border. Thanks so much. A turning point in the history of our continent. That's how Chancellor Olaf Scholz described Russia's war against Ukraine. Speaking to a special session of Parliament, the German leader announced a raft of policy changes that would have been unthinkable just days ago. Germany will drastically strengthen its military and move quickly to eliminate its reliance on Russian energy exports. He put the blame squarely on Russian President Vladimir Putin, who he said had brought decades of peaceful coexistence to an end. Here's the German Chancellor earlier today.
Putin
wants to create a Russian empire. He wants to reconfigure Europe according to his own ideas, and he does not hesitate to use military violence. We see this today in Ukraine. So we must ask ourselves what capabilities Putin's Russia has, and what capabilities do we need to meet this threat today and in the future. We must invest more in the security of our country to defend our freedom and democracy. From now on, year for year, more than 2% of our GDP will be invested in defense.
Well, we spoke to our chief political correspondent, Michaela Küffner, earlier and put it to her that this is a historic change in German foreign and defence policy.
Absolutely. This is a paradigm shift in German defence policy. Frankly, we've seen more change in that in the past 24 hours than in the previous 24 years. That is now safe to say. It started when Saturday evening we got news that Olaf Scholz is now planning for Germany to directly deliver weapons to Ukraine, although we're not sure yet in which shape or form that handover will actually take place. And then today we heard from a Social Democrat chancellor whose chief whip in Parliament is really leaning in the direction of having tried to understand Russia in the past, more of a pacifist kind of angle. Well, he, out of all people, now announced these 100 billion on top of the ordinary defense budget. That's more than twice the current defense budget here in Germany. And he's also agreed to above 2% of GDP going into defense, the latest as of 2024. This is something Donald Trump tried to get the Germans to move towards throughout his tenure and failed. And this has all just happened over the past 24 hours.
Michaela Küffner there. Meanwhile, here in Berlin, more than 100,000 people joined a rally for peace in Ukraine. The turnout far exceeded the numbers organisers were hoping for. The gathering was one of many held in cities around the world, calling for an end to hostilities. Pressure groups, including workers' unions and religious and environmental organisations, took part. DW correspondent Thomas Sparrow was there. He sent us this assessment.
Tens of thousands of people gathered today right here in the center of Berlin for a peace demonstration in support of Ukraine and against Vladimir Putin's actions. There were older people, grandmothers concerned about the current situation, also families with younger children asking for politicians to do more to help children. It was also a very international protest with people from around the world showing their support. Many people here were also asking the German government to do more, and many told us that they were happy that the German government had decided to reverse its long-standing decision and is now willing to send defensive weapons to Ukraine.
You're watching DW News. Let's recap the latest developments in the invasion on Ukraine. And Russia and Ukraine have agreed to hold peace talks. Delegations are due to meet on Ukraine's border with Belarus. Vladimir Putin, meanwhile, has put Russia's nuclear forces on alert. He's blaming the West for the decision, but the US says the Russian leader is manufacturing threats. Fighting continues as Russian forces try to press deeper into Ukraine. Fuel depots have come under attack, but the mayor of Kiev says the capital is still holding out. The European Union is organising a massive logistical operation to deal with hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians fleeing their homeland.